All right, let's talk about Jim and me wrapping up our day shift at the plant and heading home together in my car. It's our thing to carpool whenever our schedules match up, and this week it's my turn to drive. So as we leave the plant, Jim and I are on our way home. He mentions he needs to swing by a pharmacy to grab some meds for his wife, Sally, who's been dealing with a nasty cold. Funny enough, as we're cruising along, we pass by the pharmacy where my wife, Rachel, happens to work. Feeling spontaneous, I got the idea to surprise both Jim and Rachel with a visit. Despite Rachel working at the pharmacy for years, I'd never dropped in on her. I figured my sudden appearance would catch her off guard in a good way. Visiting Rachel at work always felt tricky, because I didn't want to create a stir with her colleagues or bosses. Oddly, Rachel never mentioned wanting me to visit during her shifts, but today felt different. Since she was on duty, I knew my surprise visit would be a pleasant shock for her. Rachel only worked at the pharmacy twice a week, and after 6 years there, I figured it was time I met her boss. Our 9 years of marriage had been comfortable. My factory job provided a decent living. Initially, I preferred Rachel staying home, but she wanted to work after 2 years of marriage. She felt she needed a change and wanted to be more independent, even get her own car. So, I supported her decision, especially since her earnings would help with the car. A year later, Rachel gave birth to our daughter, Sandy. She decided to stay home and focus on raising Sandy for the next couple of years. But as Sandy grew, Rachel wanted to return to work part-time. She had already spoken to her old boss, Mr. Clarkson, who agreed to take her back. After some thought, I agreed, and Rachel arranged for her mom to watch Sandy on work days. For the past 3 years, Rachel had been working hard at the pharmacy under Mr. Clarkson's guidance. Surprisingly, I never visited her workplace, even though Sandy was almost 6. Jim and I parked and headed inside. The room was pretty big, like your average drugstore, with shelves filled with all sorts of stuff, from cough syrup to other meds. Jim and I went straight to the back, thinking we'd find Rachel there. But surprise, surprise, there was just some middle-aged guy behind the counter. He grabbed Jim's prescription and got to work. I wanted to ask about Rachel, but with Jim next to me, I held back. Didn't want to give away my confusion, you know? While the pharmacist was busy, Jim started poking around, checking out the stuff on display. I saw my chance and snuck to the back of the pharmacy. That's when I saw it. A photo of a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, hanging on the wall. She looked so much like Sandy, my own daughter. It was uncanny. Same curly hair, same blue eyes, even the smile. I couldn't believe it. It was like I was looking at Sandy from the future, a year or so down the road. It got me curious, you know? So I mustered up the courage to ask the pharmacist about the kid in the photo. He was still busy counting pills, but he shook his head and said, "No, that's Katie, Mr. Clarkson's daughter." His words hit me hard. I stared at the photo again, thinking about how sweet Katie looked. I was speechless for a moment, pretending to be interested in something on a nearby shelf as I tried to wrap my head around it all. It left me feeling uneasy, like something wasn't right. How could this Katie look so much like Sandy, and where was Rachel in all of this? A creepy feeling nagged at me, hinting that I might not like the answers to my questions, but I wasn't ready to deal with them just yet. Needing to get away, I told Jim I'd wait for him in the car. Alone with my thoughts, it hit me that Sandy didn't look anything like Rachel or me. Her features were totally different, especially her hair. Rachel and I both had dark hair and brown eyes, but Sandy's hair was bright blonde when she was little. I remembered all those times my buddies joked about Sandy's hair color, teasing me about her resemblance to the mailman or asking if I had Pete's head delivered to our house. Back then, I laughed it off, knowing it was all in good fun. But now, those innocent jokes felt like a punch in the gut. Doubt gnawed at me relentlessly. Was Sandy really my daughter, or was she Mr. Clarkson's kid? I was overwhelmed with uncertainty, questioning everything about my role as her dad. What really threw me off was that I'd never met Carl Clarkson, so I had no idea what he looked like besides having blonde hair. Rachel had mentioned him a few times in passing. Later that evening, when Rachel and I were at home, she noticed I was quiet and lost in thought. Worried, she asked if something was wrong. Of course, I didn't spill about my trip to her workplace or the thoughts racing through my head. I was dying to know where she was when I showed up unexpectedly, but I kept my doubts to myself. I knew I had to tread carefully, realizing how delicate the situation was. Instead of rushing to conclusions and blaming Rachel for something that might just be in my head, I realized I needed solid proof to confirm or dismiss my doubts about my daughter's parentage. The idea that my sweet angel might not be my biological child was incredibly painful to even consider. My love for her knew no bounds, and I was ready to do whatever it took for her sake. Trying to make sense of it all, I desperately clung to the hope that the similarities between the two girls were just a coincidence. But I couldn't shake off that lingering suspicion in the back of my mind. It refused to be ignored. As I lay in bed beside my wife that night, the weight of the day's events hit me hard. If Carl Clarkson turned out to be Sandy's biological father, it meant Rachel had been keeping this from me all along, ever since she started working for him 6 years ago. I had thought she was still involved with her lover during that time. It felt like she had been deceiving me for years. Every time she came home after spending time with her boss, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was secretly reveling in fooling me, making me believe her lies about her affair. Yeah, I had already picked up on her suspicious behavior, I told myself, remembering how she'd rush to shower as soon as she got home, claiming she needed to wash off the smell of the chemicals from work. It was clear to me that she was in a hurry to cleanse herself of any evidence of her recent infidelity. The next day was Friday, and since Rachel didn't have to work, I decided to stop by her workplace to see if I could catch her there. It felt strange, almost surreal, contemplating confronting my own wife about her possible betrayal. But I needed answers, and I needed them now. The next day rolled around Friday, and since Rachel didn't have to punch in at work, I decided to swing by her workplace after dropping Jim off at his place. I figured it was about time I came face to face with Carl Clarkson. I'd never met the guy, and he had no clue I even existed, so I thought it was high time I introduced myself. I asked the receptionist about Mr. Clarkson's whereabouts, only to find out he had already left for the day, but she pointed me toward his assistant, Mr. Mann, who might be able to help me out. Following her gesture, I spotted the same guy who had filled Jim's prescription the day before. I politely explained that I'd swing by another time since I had something personal to chat with Mr. Clarkson about. Suddenly, she chimed in, telling me not to drop by the pharmacy on Tuesday or Thursday afternoons, since Mr. Clarkson was always MIA during those times. I just nodded in response, trying to process this new info. As I hopped into my car, a jumble of thoughts swirled in my mind. Rachel was supposed to be working alongside Mr. Clarkson on those exact days. Her job was to help out with prescriptions and all that stuff. Yet here I was, finding out that he'd be missing on the days she was supposed to be working with him. It left me scratching my head, wondering what Rachel was really up to on those days. Was she tagging along with him somewhere else? I couldn't shake this heavy feeling about her job, especially with the image of Sandy's picture sitting on her desk flashing through my mind. Doubts about her faithfulness were starting to gnaw at me more and more each day. Was she getting involved with her boss, or was I just letting my imagination run wild? I was dead set on finding proof of Rachel's cheating. Spending the weekend cooped up at home with her felt like torture. Every time I glanced her way, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was sneaking around with her boss. But the kicker? I didn't even know what the guy looked like, which drove me nuts. Deep down, I had this nagging feeling that our daughter Sandy might not be mine biologically. That suspicion ate away at me, leading me to believe Rachel had been two-timing me this whole time. Heck, maybe she was even carrying her lover's second kid. It seemed like she was stepping out on me way more than I realized. Just thinking about her got me boiling with anger. I couldn't look at her without feeling this intense frustration that fueled my determination to uncover the truth. Saturday morning rolled around, and as she slept soundly beside me, I couldn't help but watch her. Sure, she was a looker, but the idea of her betrayal weighed on me, drowning out any admiration. We barely said a word to each other all morning, stuck in this awkward silence. Even at the breakfast table, I found myself chatting mostly with Sandy, intentionally avoiding Rachel. Then, that night, I woke her up suddenly, wanting to reclaim what I felt was rightfully mine. There were no sweet kisses or loving words exchanged between us. Instead, it was just rough and passionless. It was my way of getting back at her, punishing her for straying with another guy. What struck me as odd was Rachel's lack of protest. She didn't utter a single word of disapproval at my strange behavior. To me, that said it all. It was like she had something to hide, and she was trying to keep me quiet by letting things get physical. I didn't have any solid proof of her cheating back then. I couldn't even explain why I was acting the way I was. All I knew was that I had this strong urge to hurt her. Maybe her silence was because she was scared, but why would she be afraid of her own husband, unless she had something to hide? All she seemed to want was for my anger to simmer down so we could go back to our usual routine. I could tell she was avoiding talking to me, like she was afraid I'd uncover her deepest secret. To keep the peace, she just went along with whatever I wanted, even if it meant putting up with the humiliation I put her through. Every day I became more convinced she was fooling around with her boss. I'm convinced their sneaky affair had been going on for years. I used to be a loving and attentive husband, but now I only saw her as a way to satisfy my own needs, ignoring hers completely. The love and connection between us? It vanished. Instead, I sought revenge by being selfish and forceful during our intimate moments. I didn't feel bad about it. I thought she deserved it. As time went on, I noticed this growing fear and anxiety in her eyes. One evening, I sat across from her at the kitchen table, and there was this tension in the air. I could tell she suspected I found out about her affair with Carl. She was hesitant to bring it up, avoiding a direct conversation. I couldn't understand why she was so scared. I'd never laid a hand on her. Maybe she wasn't ready to end our marriage, craving the security it offered while still wanting the excitement of her secret fling. Did her fling with her boss drag her into this mess of lies? Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to gather proof of her cheating. So, I took the following Tuesday off to tail her at her workplace. I was sure they hadn't met at the pharmacy where she usually worked, so they must have rendezvoused elsewhere to fool me. To keep a low profile, I borrowed Jim's truck for the day, allowing me to trail her discreetly. Tuesday morning rolled around, and I suited up like it was any other workday. I swung by Jim's place to swap cars, handing him my keys in exchange. After snagging his truck, I parked a few houses down from mine to keep an eye on things. Not long after, I spotted Rachel and Sandy hopping into her car. I tailed them as they dropped Sandy off at school, trying not to attract attention. Rachel headed straight to the drugstore, and I parked Jim's truck across the street, settling in for the wait. With the radio softly playing in the background, I sat tight, ready for whatever was coming. I had a clear view of Rachel's red Toyota and the pharmacy's parking lot from where I sat. I was prepared to stick it out all day if necessary. About 30 minutes after Rachel went in, I noticed a sleek black SUV pulling into the lot. A tall, well-dressed guy around 35 stepped out, heading for a side entrance near the pharmacy. His appearance grabbed my attention, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to go down. The moment he stepped out of the car, it hit me like a bolt of lightning. I recognized him as the father of the girl in those photos. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. This man wasn't just my wife's secret lover, he was likely also Sandy's real dad. For 6 long years, he'd been deceiving me, playing the role of a hidden stranger. Anger surged through me, tempting me to chase after him and unleash my fury. I even briefly entertained violent thoughts toward my wife, but I knew that wasn't the answer. The window for reacting to my anger had long passed. It was too late, 6 years too late. If I had confronted her after the first or second instance of cheating, maybe there would have been a chance to salvage our marriage. But after enduring 6 years of consistent betrayal, with infidelity occurring maybe twice a week, any hope of reconciliation evaporated. It was time to end things with her and hold them both accountable for their actions. Vengeful thoughts consumed me as I waited patiently in Jim's car until noon. Then, the door swung open, and Rachel and her lover emerged from the building. Their smiles, so convincing to the untrained eye, couldn't fool me anymore. They looked like any content couple, climbing into his SUV and driving off. Following them wasn't difficult. My wife's lover seemed unhurried. After about 15 minutes of driving, we reached a country road leading to a lake. 10 more minutes passed, and I watched as they turned confidently into the driveway of a quaint log cottage by the lake. I parked Jim's car half a mile away, keeping out of sight. Quietly, I made my way toward the cottage, noting the tall, neatly trimmed cedar hedge surrounding the property. Thankfully, it shielded me from view, giving me the privacy I needed to observe. Slowly, I circled the house until I heard voices drifting from an open window on the left side of the cottage. Approaching cautiously, I peered through the slightly open window, which was just about shoulder height. Inside, the room was dimly lit, taking a moment for my eyes to adjust. Soon enough, the scene became clear. A man and a woman were on the bed, lost in their intimate moments. They seemed completely consumed by their desires, oblivious to the world around them. As I focused on the man's face, I couldn't shake the feeling of recognition. He bore an uncanny resemblance to Sandy, my daughter, the same thin nose, hair color, and eyes. In that moment, all doubts vanished. It was undeniable. Carl Clarkson was indeed Sandy's biological father. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Carl, my wife's lover, was the father of my daughter. For years, Rachel had deceived me, leading me to believe I was Sandy's biological father. They must have laughed at my ignorance behind my back, mocking my cluelessness. The betrayal cut deep, and I couldn't shake the thought of them planning another child together. Despite the hurt and shock, one thing remained unchanged: my love for Sandy. She was, and always will be, my daughter in my heart. No one could ever take that bond away from me. But witnessing my wife in the arms of another man was a gut-wrenching sight. It's something no husband should ever have to see. Mixed emotions overwhelmed me: anger, sadness, and a sense of betrayal. I found myself at a loss, unsure of what to do next. Tears flowed freely, mingling with feelings of self-doubt and frustration. Not having my camera with me was a regret. It could have provided concrete proof of her infidelity. At that moment, I knew divorce was my only option. I needed solid evidence to present to the judge, something that would strengthen my case and improve my chances of gaining custody of Sandy. It was a painful decision, but one I knew I had to make for the sake of my daughter's future. Witnessing the woman I once loved engage in secret rendezvous with another man was excruciating. I couldn't bear to watch or listen to their interactions any longer. Quietly, I retreated to the car, desperate to divert my mind from the heart-wrenching scene unfolding before me. The love I once held for her had evaporated, replaced by a burning desire for revenge against her clandestine lover. Little did I know, the events that followed would forever alter their lives. That evening, Rachel returned home as usual after a tiring day at work. Without a word, she headed upstairs for a refreshing shower while I busied myself with preparing dinner, a routine task for days when she worked. Conversation was sparse, but Sandy filled the air with chatter about her day at school, drawing our attention away from the tension between Rachel and me. The following morning was Wednesday, and Rachel had the day off. Clad in her robe, she joined Sandy and me at the breakfast table for a family meal. I noticed her stealing glances at me when she thought I wasn't looking, her expression betraying a mix of emotions. It was clear she suspected that I had discovered her illicit affair with her boss. There was a hint of fear in her gaze. As evening descended and Rachel tidied up the dishes in the kitchen, I decided to share a story with her, a fictional tale. I recounted the story of a factory worker who discovered his wife's infidelity and reacted violently. I described how his co-workers plotted revenge against her lover. Rachel listened in silence, her eyes widening with each word. Finally, she turned to me, seeking my opinion on the matter. Calmly, I explained that betrayal had consequences, emphasizing the gravity of infidelity and its impact on marriage. It was only right, I asserted, that both the unfaithful wife and her lover faced consequences for their disregard of marital vows. Tuesday arrived, and I again decided to take the day off, opting to use Jim's truck for the day. Around noon, I sat in my car enjoying lunch before putting my plan into action. This time, I headed towards a cottage by a serene lake, knowing Carl's black SUV would be parked outside. Equipped with a video camera, I aimed to capture undeniable evidence of their betrayal, essential not only for securing custody of Sandy, but also for revealing the truth to Carl's unsuspecting wife. My goal was to inflict maximum pain on him for his illicit affair with my wife. Initially, I contemplated DNA tests for both Sandy and me to provide conclusive proof of her infidelity. However, I realized that revealing I wasn't Sandy's biological father could backfire, giving my wife an opportunity to take her away in court. Instead, I opted to feign ignorance, relying on the videotape of their intimate moments as evidence. Once again, as before, they were lost in their playful intimacy on the bed, unaware of my recording. Amid their actions, I overheard Carl discussing his plans to sabotage his wife's ability to get a driver's license, intending to hinder her from following him. Later, Rachel confided in Carl about my recent odd behavior, expressing her fear that I might be onto their affair. Carl's growing nervousness was palpable, signaling it was time to end my surveillance, armed with enough evidence of their treachery. When I got back home, I slipped back into the routine of cooking dinner while she was still at work. Her usual quitting time was around 6 o'clock, and she'd walk through the door about 15 minutes after that. It hit me all of a sudden that during those work hours, she and Carl must have been off on their secretive escapades, typically from 2:30 to 5:30 in the afternoon. While I busied myself in the kitchen, oblivious to the impending collapse of our once happy home, a plan began to form in my mind that very evening. I decided to leverage the power of intimidation. Now let me make it clear that resorting to violence is not my style. However, I couldn't deny the impact of that made-up story about the factory worker who snapped when he found out about his wife's affair. It shook Rachel to her core. Coupled with the newfound control I had over her, it likely contributed to the perception she had of me. At this point, I figured she was just biding her time, waiting for the right moment to sever our ties. Maybe she was eagerly anticipating the day when she could serve me with divorce papers and run into her lover's arms for good. The next Wednesday during dinner, I broached the subject again, bringing up a coworker's unhappy situation. I recounted how he had finally taken revenge on the man who had betrayed him. I painted a vivid picture of the lover lying in a hospital bed, receiving the consequences of his actions. Stoking the fires of her fear, I disclosed that the betrayed husband had filed for divorce, seeking custody of their children. Rachel's shock was palpable as she listened to my words. She continued eating in silence, but her trembling hands gave away her inner turmoil. The following day, when she returned from one of her secret meetings, her nerves were evident. Fear emanated from her every move, catching my keen eye. During dinner, I deliberately steered the conversation toward her workplace, subtly probing about her boss, his appearance, his family, and other details. Until that moment, I hadn't really paid much attention to Rachel's boss, so my sudden interest in him made her uneasy and me suspicious. I started asking about her job at the pharmacy and how happy she was there. To add to her uncertainty and raise her anxieties, I casually mentioned that I might drop by her workplace unexpectedly one day. She looked shocked, but stayed silent, wearing a strange expression on her face. Slowly, she nodded, unable to find the right words. Over the weekend, I decided to take Rachel and Sandy out to dinner, trying to keep up the appearance of a happy family. But even Sandy could tell that something was off with her mom lately. My daughter sought solace in me, directing her questions and seeking comfort only in my presence. As we neared the end of our meal that evening, Sandy excused herself to the restroom, leaving Rachel and me alone. Sensing a moment of privacy, I gently asked Rachel if something was bothering her and if she wanted to talk about it. "Roger, I've noticed a change in you lately," she began, her voice tinged with confusion and concern. "It's been a while since we've been close. Can you remember the last time we were intimate?" Her eyes searched mine, revealing her worry. It was clear she was starting to feel guilty, but admitting her infidelity wasn't part of her plan. Even if she had confessed, I knew forgiveness wasn't an option. Her betrayal not only hurt our marriage, but also Sandy. She knew it too. "I love you, Roger," she whispered, desperation evident in her words. "But lately I feel like you look at me with hatred instead of love." Taking a deep breath, I met her gaze, unable to hold back any longer. "Tell me, Rachel, are you cheating on me? If so, then it's over between us, and you'll never see our daughter again. I promise you that." With those words, I finally confronted the truth that had been weighing heavily on my heart. The truth hung in the air between us as Rachel's eyes met mine, her face a mix of shock and speechlessness. Tears welled up in her eyes, an unexpected display of her emotions. She hastily grabbed her purse and fled the restaurant, leaving behind a trail of uncertainty. While Sandy was still in the restroom, I settled the bill and waited patiently for her to join me. Leaving the restaurant, I spotted Rachel by the car, her eyes swollen with tears, though no more tears seemed to flow. The next Monday, I approached my boss and requested a 2-week break to deal with my family crisis. Initially hesitant, my boss agreed after I explained the seriousness of the situation. That evening, I found myself in Carl's driveway, contemplating my next move. Sitting in my car, I pondered the uncertain future ahead, unsure of my plan. I felt compelled to meet Carl's wife and disclose the truth. Spotting her in the backyard by the pool, my determination grew. She bore a resemblance to Rachel, with her tall stature and light brown hair. Summoning my courage, I approached the fence entrance, my heart racing. Slowly, I crossed the backyard, observing her rearranging chairs around the pool. Finally reaching her, I introduced myself nervously. "I'm Roger Weldon, and my wife Rachel works with your husband at the pharmacy." Her gaze briefly tensed before a smile graced her lips. She extended her hand, accepting my introduction. "Yes, I've heard of Rachel, although we've never met," Claudine Clarkson replied warmly, our hands clasping in greeting. It became evident she was unaware of her husband's affair. Realizing the impact of the truth I was about to reveal, I knew it would be painful for her. Despite this, she deserved to know the reality. With urgency, I decided to be direct. "I apologize for the solemn nature of this meeting, Mrs. Clarkson," I began, the gravity of the situation evident in my tone. "I have something to tell you, and I know it will cause you great pain. Your husband and my wife have been involved in a long-standing affair." The words hung in the air as she stood before me, her expression frozen in shock. For a moment she stared at me silently, her mouth slightly open. Then tears welled in her eyes like a fragile dam. She remained still, unable to utter a word, until finally, overwhelmed, she covered her mouth with both hands in bewilderment. Before I could detail everything that had unfolded, she interjected, mustering courage to inquire if I had tangible proof. "Yes," I affirmed firmly, "I have evidence of their affair. I possess photos of them together at your lakeside cottage, and there could be more evidence out there." Their relationship lasted over 6 years. As those words left my mouth, another shocking revelation emerged. I strongly suspected her husband was my daughter's biological father. The weight of my statement caused Claudine to lose her composure. Tears overwhelmed her, and I swiftly guided her inside. Leading her to the couch, I patiently waited, allowing her a moment to regain her composure. Seating myself across from her, I carefully retrieved a photo of my daughter from my wallet, extending it to Claudine. "This is Sandy, my daughter," I began, noting Sandy's resemblance to her husband, the blonde hair, thin nose, and high cheekbones. "She bears a striking resemblance to your daughter as well." Turning my gaze to the photo of her daughter on the mantelpiece, I rose, retrieving it and placing both pictures side by side on the coffee table. "Look at this undeniable resemblance, Mrs. Clarkson," I urged, highlighting the connection between our daughters. "The evidence speaks for itself. They are sisters, related by blood." Claudine's tears subsided as she clutched both pictures, studying them intently. After a moment, she met my eyes, desperation evident. "What should we do?" she implored. Pausing to gather my thoughts, I responded decisively. "Ultimately, I've chosen to divorce my wife and seek custody of my daughter." Acknowledging the gravity of our situation, I realized this was likely the fairest resolution for us both. After grappling with doubts, I faced the harsh reality. Carl had indeed betrayed me. As the one responsible for laundry, the evidence had been in my hands all along. He wouldn't escape accountability for his actions. Justice would be served. "Mrs. Clarkson, I strongly advise you to consult a lawyer. I can provide you with copies of the photos I have, but we should wait before exposing their affair," I suggested. "There's a strategic reason for this, and I'll explain." Retrieving the tape from the car, we watched a portion together as Claudine continued to weep, overcome with emotion. Claudine continued sobbing, overwhelmed by emotions. After a few minutes, she requested to pause the tape, needing a break from the harsh truth unfolding before her eyes. Once Claudine composed herself, I explained my intentions and plans. I proposed that we wait a few days before confronting the couple about their affair. Despite her heavy heart, she reluctantly agreed to this plan. On Tuesday, I consulted my attorney, sharing the photos of the unfaithful wife. However, the lawyer cautioned that gaining custody of Sandy wouldn't be easy, especially since I'm not her biological father. He warned that if my wife demanded a DNA test and proved I wasn't Sandy's biological father, it could weaken my case significantly. Considering the potential consequences, I realized pursuing a child support lawsuit against Carl might result in losing custody of Sandy, a scenario I wanted to avoid at all costs. Understanding this, I decided to halt any legal action for the time being. Recognizing the need to take matters into my own hands, I devised a plan to compel my wife to leave our home and willingly give me custody of Sandy. This became my new objective, and I began strategizing a complex path to ensure my daughter's safety. If I could persuade my wife to leave with her lover even briefly, it might work in my favor. This would create doubt about her ability to gain custody of our daughter in the event of our divorce. With no DNA tests conducted yet, there was no solid evidence I wasn't Sandy's biological father. It occurred to me that a judge wouldn't view favorably a mother having an affair with another man. When Rachel returned from work that afternoon, signs of her infidelity were evident. Her lips were glossy and moist, suggesting intimacy. Upon learning I knew about her affair, tears streamed down her face as she apologized profusely. She tried to communicate, expressing remorse and pledging to end the affair with Carl and quit her job. She professed love only for me, begging for forgiveness and promising to make amends. Yet it was clear she was lying. Listening to the disparaging remarks she made about me while at the cottage with her lover, I realized she had no genuine intention of leaving him. Despite her attempts to delay, it became painfully obvious that Rachel had chosen to leave me for Carl. The only thing holding her back from leaving right away was Sandy, and her fear of how I would react immediately. To push Rachel to flee with her boss, I knew I had to ramp up her fear. I wanted her to be scared not just for herself, but also for her lover's safety. Speaking calmly, I made it crystal clear that forgiveness wasn't on the table. I explicitly warned her that my retaliation against her and Carl would be agonizingly painful. I purposefully omitted the fact that I wasn't Sandy's biological father. Later that day, I followed through with my suggestion and drove to Claudine's house. She had consulted the same lawyer I hired for legal advice. Claudine informed me that her lawyer had already made significant progress on divorce papers for both of us. She also mentioned her husband's odd behavior over the past day. She had noticed him discreetly loading boxes into his SUV, unaware she was watching from the yard. From this, she inferred he was secretly planning to leave the family. I reassured Claudine, suggesting this unexpected development might work in her favor. If her husband chose to abandon them, it could greatly improve her chances of gaining custody of their daughter. I stressed that by deserting his family, he would be jeopardizing everything. Such actions would reflect poorly on him in front of a judge if it came to that. Predictably, Rachel didn't show up for work on Tuesday. She claimed she quit her job and promised never to speak to Carl again. But I showed no interest in her pledges. I knew she was lying, and truthfully, I wasn't planning to stay married to her much longer. That afternoon, I discreetly observed as she packed her belongings from the bedroom. It was evident she too intended to leave me soon. However, I was resolved not to let her take Sandy with her. To further stoke her desire to run away with her lover, I deliberately chose to intensify her fear. That very day, I shared my plan to deal with Carl the following week. When she asked about the fate of our marriage, I simply stated that once I handled her lover, I would decide what to do with her. When I looked into her eyes, I saw unmistakable terror reflected in her silent gaze. It's essential to mention that violence isn't in my nature. Leading up to this moment, I always treated our relationship with tenderness, both in and out of the bedroom. But when I discovered that she had broken our marriage vows over 6 years ago and was still doing so, the love I once felt for her vanished into thin air. I became a different person, consumed by sadness and anger. It's crucial to note that this change didn't drive me to violence, but rather to profound emotional distress. The next day, I escorted Sandy to school and spoke urgently to the school principal. I emphasized the seriousness of the situation, explaining that my wife planned to run away with another man and possibly even take our daughter. I stressed that under no circumstances would I allow Sandy to leave the school grounds with my wife or anyone else without my explicit permission. To ensure Sandy's safety, I devised a plan where I would personally drive her to school every day and have her wait inside until I returned to pick her up. This way, she'd be under the school's tight security until I arrived. After picking Sandy up from school, I returned home, fully aware that my wife was on the verge of running away. In the evening, I drove to Claudine's house, knowing that my absence might prompt my wife to contact Carl. I saw this as an opportunity since I hoped they would carry out their plan to run away together. My main goal was to remove my wife from my life and distance myself from Carl as much as possible. Filing for divorce with an unfaithful wife was no longer an option because she might use it to take Sandy away from me legally. Instead, I planned to create a situation where she'd feel compelled to leave with Carl, leaving our daughter behind. Even if it meant temporarily moving across the country with Sandy, I was determined to do it. Arriving at Claudine's house, I found her in tears. She told me that Carl had taken most of his things without explanation. It was clear he'd waited for a moment when I wasn't home to meet Rachel, but my immediate concern was ensuring they didn't take Sandy. Without hesitation, I drove to Sandy's school. To my horror, I saw Carl's car passing by, Rachel beside him, having spotted my car. Realizing they'd been seen, they quickly left. Luckily, Sandy was still at school, so I picked her up and took her home. Later, I told Sandy that her mother had to visit a sick relative, shielding her from the harsh truth. The next day, I changed all the locks on the doors and informed my lawyer that Rachel had left with her lover. I contacted a real estate agent to sell the house quickly, specifying it was solely in my name. That evening, I called Claudine and heard her crying. She told me Carl left a note saying he'd fallen in love with someone else, consulted a lawyer, and transferred the house and cottage solely to her name. He left her some money in the bank as well. Feeling deeply sympathetic, I couldn't shake the sense of responsibility for the tough situation that had unfolded. I explained to Claudine how Sandy was affected by her mother's absence. While ordering a big pizza and salad, I suggested she bring Katie along for dinner. To my surprise, Claudine and Katie showed up at my home just 15 minutes later. Looking back, inviting them over turned out to be one of the best choices I made. Sandy and Katie hit it off right away, which helped ease Sandy's feelings about her mom not being there. Claudine's presence also brought comfort to our home. We spent the evening together, enjoying each other's company and finding solace. Our bond deepened quickly, and Claudine eventually decided to sell her cottage and move in with me. Our relationship blossomed into a loving family with 2 wonderful daughters. From the outside, it seemed like we were a happily married couple, united and content. Recognizing the need to start anew, I promptly began the process of selling my house. Claudine and I talked about the importance of relocating somewhere our exes wouldn't easily track us down. We envisioned a future where we could leave the past behind and create a fresh life together. Less than a month after Rachel left, I found myself in Texas with Claudine and our 2 girls. My career as a contractor flourished, allowing me to build a beautiful home and become a respected member of the community. Over time, I realized that this line of work was not only profitable, but also fulfilling. Now, I oversee a team of 5 employees. It's been 5 years since Claudine and I moved to Texas. We're seen as a happy, prosperous couple raising our 2 daughters, Sandy and Katie. Just last year, we welcomed a baby boy into our family. While we haven't heard from Rachel and Carl, we still hope for their well-being, though we've accepted that they may have faced consequences for their actions. For us, life is wonderful. We've created a loving, fulfilling family life, untouched by the pain of infidelity. Every moment we spend together is precious, filled with love and happiness.